This course contains recitations of the Quran in a secular context.
What can the Quran itself tell us about the earliest moments of Islamic history? The revelation of the Quran is routinely divided into two distinct categories: those surahs or chapters revealed in Mecca, and those revealed after the Hijrah, or migration to Medina. This division is more than a geographic one, however, as the locale is also an indicator of tonal, thematic, and content differences in the revelations. Once Muhammad and his followers established residence in Medina, the community needed social and organizational guidance, and the Quran provided it. But before the text could provide a blueprint for how the community of believers should organize themselves, the community first had to be created. The Meccan surahs are dominated by what we might call an evangelizing mission. The audience for Muhammad's recitation was a community of diverse but specific religious and cultural customs. Predominantly, the Meccans valued the various idols and figures housed in the Kaaba, which would likely have included a variety of Arabian deities, as well as perhaps some Christian iconography. In addition, since pilgrimage to Mecca was a primary source for the local economy, allegiance was not just to the figures themselves, but also to the very practical benefit that being home to a site of ritual pilgrimage provided. In short, Muhammad's revelation was both a religious and economic challenge to the entrenched powers of Mecca. The Quran's message in the earliest surahs radically challenged the status quo, disrupting Meccan social and economic customs and becoming, after a while, a dangerous endeavor for Muhammad. Additionally, the worldview of the Quran would have struck its earliest audience as strange and foreign, especially those passages that envision the end times and divine judgment. That is, the emphasis on an ultimate judgment day, during which God will weigh our deeds and offer us entrance into a garden paradise, or conversely, send us to an eternal punishment. This vision was not common in 7th century Arabia. While some nominal notion of heaven and hell may have been familiar from Christian or Zoroastrian merchants, the more common belief was what we might call an epic ethos. Death is final and non-negotiable, so one's legacy came through fame, fortune, or family. The advantage of this worldview was that it was easy to make an accounting of one's status before death, as what you had and where you stood are readily ascertainable. But the vision of cosmic justice supplied by the Quran was of a different existential order. Finally, the language the Quran employs in the earliest surahs exhibits a keen sense of audience. As we know, public recitation of epic poetry was a popular and sophisticated art form during Muhammad's time. Seemingly attuned to this, many of the Meccan surahs employ tropes and figures of speech that would have been familiar to listeners at least at the outset. But the Quran often subverts the expected conclusions. Let's look at an example. In this case, my favorite surah from the Meccan period of the Quran, Surah 100. We heard this surah in recitation earlier. It reads,
وَالْعَادِيَاتِ ضَبْحًا.
In the name of God, the Lord of mercy, the giver of mercy, by the charging steeds, panting and striking sparks with their hooves, who make dawn raids, raising a cloud of dust, and plunging into the midst of the enemy. Man is ungrateful to his Lord, and he is witness to this. He is truly excessive in his love of wealth. Does he not know that when the contents of graves are thrown out, when the secrets of hearts are uncovered, on that day, their Lord will be fully aware of them all? This remarkable passage would have, and I think still does, hit with a kind of concussive, visceral force. The opening lines paint a scene that would have been familiar and exciting for 7th century Meccans. Powerful horses bursting out of the desert in a tumult, as if to raid a lucrative trading caravan. The martial imagery calls to mind the epic ethos of pre-Islamic Arabia, one in which glory in battle and the spoils of victory are the only sure reward. Muhammad's audience would certainly have made these connections for themselves and would be primed to hear a tale extolling these familiar virtues. The scene, however, pivots abruptly with the plaintive judgment of human greed. Man is ungrateful to his Lord, and he is witness to this. He is truly excessive in his love of wealth. Rather than praise for daring do, the surah instead critiques the values of warfare and raiding, upsetting both the expectations and the values of the audience. This reversal of both the assumed direction of the story and of the moral framework common to 7th century Arabia marks the genius of the early Meccan surahs. Time and again, the earliest revelations begin by playing to the expectations of the audience, using images and tropes one might hear during any poetry recitation, and then upends those same images with a clarion call for moral re-evaluation. The moral judgment is accompanied by another significant revision to pre-Islamic tradition. Prior to Muhammad, death was understood as either an ultimate end, or if an afterlife was imagined, it paralleled the shadowy underworld familiar to us from Greek thought, a place of dim, ethereal existence where all are equally cut off from the joys of embodied life. Perhaps the key innovation of the Quranic revelation, then, is the repeated insistence on a day of reckoning, Yawm ad-Din. As Surah 100 describes it, when the contents of graves are thrown out, when the secrets of hearts are uncovered, on that day their Lord will be fully aware of them all. Here, death is not the final end. Instead, God will remove us from the grave to judge. That Surah 100 phrases this as a question, does he not know? Implies that Muhammad's audience did not readily accept this eschatological vision. Let's take another example. Surah 101 reads, "The crashing blow." What is the crashing blow? What will explain to you what the crashing blow is? On a day when people will be like scattered moths and the mountains like tufts of wool, the one whose good deeds are heavy on the scales will have a pleasing life, but the one whose good deeds are light will have the bottomless pit for his home. What will explain to you what that is? A blazing fire. Similar to Surah 100, a violent, perhaps exciting image is first evoked. But here again, this image is almost instantly turned on its head. Rather than the valiant warrior vanquishing a foe, the crashing blow is instead the crushing realization that we will be judged for our deeds on an apocalyptic day, when people will be scattered like moths and the mountains like tufts of wool. The precision and vividness of the language was surely effective in appealing to the literary tastes of the Meccan audience, a rhetorically persuasive effort. Because of the heavy lift of convincing the Meccans of this new vision, the early surahs appeal again and again to familiar imagery combined with these stylistic twists. Another recurrent theme is the use of oaths for a kind of formula. For instance, Surah 92 begins, "By the covering night, by the radiant day, by the male and female he created, the ways you take differ greatly." Here we are given contrasts, night and day, male and female, to serve a threefold purpose. 1, God is credited with the whole of creation. 2, the stark contrast served to illustrate the surah's intention of distinguishing between the path of the believer and disbeliever, the latter of whom is bound for a raging fire. And 3rd, the invocation of an oath by the covering night serves as a declaration of truth and authenticity. Just as we today swear an oath to tell the truth or defend the Constitution, the Quran asserts its honesty in reference to all of the created world, and it does so many times. Surah 93 begins, "By the morning brightness and by the night when it grows still, your Lord has not forsaken you." Similarly, Surah 95 reads, "By the fig, by the olive, by Mount Sinai, by this safe city, we created man in the finest state, then reduced him to the lowest of the low." The compounding effect is an assertion of honesty and authenticity about the recitation of Muhammad. In addition to the revelation itself, God's role as creator of the universe and the reality of Judgment Day are the most prevalent themes of the earliest surahs. Clearly, the task at the outset of Muhammad's prophetic career was to advocate for the validity of this message in general, and for these two theological principles in particular. Why was God's creative power and the truth of Judgment Day so overtly emphasized? Likely because these two ideas were most fundamentally at odds with Meccan custom and belief at the time. I've already mentioned how the existence of an afterlife was either discounted or minimized in the traditions of 7th century Arabia. In addition, and as I've discussed in a previous lecture, the economic engine of Mecca was the shrine of the Kaaba, where tribal gods were housed and venerated during an annual pilgrimage. The assertion that God, Allah, was the sole creator of the world was a direct affront to the pantheon of pagan Arab gods and to the economy of the city. This dual threat was likely responsible for the broad resistance to Muhammad's message in the early years of the revelation. Did this new vision intend to completely upend the established practices and traditions of Mecca? Yes, and it did. But before Mecca's pagan customs were abandoned, the entrenched powers in Mecca sought to expel Muhammad and his growing cadre of followers. In 622, 12 years after beginning his prophetic preaching, and after a variety of assaults, including an assassination attempt, Muhammad sought refuge in a moderately sized city northeast of Mecca called Yathrib. Tradition holds that this was a mutual agreement. Not only was Muhammad searching for a place of physical safety, but the citizens of Yathrib had endured their own civic turmoil and were in search of new leadership. As the story goes, Muhammad was invited to relocate, to serve as a kind of mayor or governor of Yathrib, and his followers were welcome to come and establish their community without physical threat. There is a longer story about this immigration, called the Hijra in Arabic, but the short version is that Muhammad did manage to construct a new and relatively united polity in Yathrib, and one that eventually grew strong enough to challenge Mecca militarily. The most significant obstacle in the initial years was the presence of 3 different Jewish tribes in Yathrib, each of whom had varying degrees of suspicion and acceptance of the presence of this new community and theological vision. The negotiations with and suppression of those who objected to Muhammad's new political authority is an important historical detail, because it sheds light on the shift in message of the Quranic verses revealed while Muhammad was in Yathrib. Since Muhammad had been invited to the city, and because he arrived with a band of committed believers, the main challenge was no longer convincing the people of the authenticity of the Quranic vision. Instead, Muhammad had to establish an enduring community, and the revelations he subsequently received are often directed to this purpose. Instructions about marital and sexual relationships, inheritance, taxation and support for the poor, the proper conduct of war, and what we might call today foreign affairs, increasingly become main themes of the Quranic message. Nowhere is this better exemplified than in Surah 2, the cow, the longest chapter in the Quran. Surah 2 is said to have been revealed over the course of a number of years, and as a result is exhaustive in its vision of what a new community of believers ought to look like. Using the story of the Israelites in the desert as they journeyed with Moses to the Promised Land as a counterpoint, Surah 2 consistently reaffirms God's grace and plan for his people, provided they do not waver in their devotion. It begins naturally enough, revisiting the different faiths of the believers and the rejectors. Those who believe in the revelation sent down to you, and in what was sent before you, those who have firm faith in the hereafter, such people are following their Lord's guidance, and it is they who will prosper. As for those who disbelieve, it makes no difference whether you warn them or not, they will not believe. God has sealed their hearts and their ears, and their eyes are covered. They will have great torment. The effect of this distinction is to draw lines around the community, an act of definition. As the community can now clearly identify itself as such, the works of social institution building can begin in earnest, exhorting the believers to remember the stories of Adam and Eve, Moses, and other familiar figures. The revelation then establishes a relationship between the followers of Muhammad and other believers. The believers, the Jews, the Christians, and the Sabians, all those who believe in God and the last day and do good, will have their rewards with their Lord. No fear for them, nor will they grieve. This important verse creates a relationship between the followers of Muhammad, here called the believers, or mu'minun in Arabic, and others who hold the core beliefs of God's reality, Judgment Day, and the virtue of good acts. All of these, the message says, will be rewarded. The implication was and remains that the message given to Muhammad was in concert with these other communities, and that there needn't be inherent tension between them. This description of what comes to be called the people of the book, al-Kitab, is followed by various allusions to Moses and Jesus, and the struggles they endured in convincing people of the truth of God's word. The implication here is clearly a struggle between a vision of a broad and inclusive community and the reality that Muhammad's message was not universally accepted. Muhammad was still working to unite disparate groups, and so the appeal to the prophetic exemplars of Moses and Jesus had obvious rhetorical value. The Quran makes this explicit. When it is said to them, "Believe in God's revelations," they reply, "We believe in what was revealed to us." But they do not believe in what came afterwards, though it is the truth confirming what they already have. Say, "Why did you kill God's prophets in the past if you were true believers? Moses brought you clear signs, but then while he was away, you chose to worship the calf. You did wrong." As in other Medinian surahs, references to biblical characters are used repeatedly as reminders directed towards Jewish and Christian groups, as if asking, "Do you not recall how all the previous prophets were criticized? Do you want to make this mistake again?" The effectiveness of this line of argument was mixed. The Jewish tribes in Medina remained largely opposed to Muhammad's message, but as the community of believers continued to grow, increasing numbers of both Jews and Christians converted. The early history of Islam was enriched by these converts, and the Quran's strategy of appealing directly to their most prominent figures seems to have been a success. About a third of the way through Surah 2, we are given a fascinating and somewhat surprising story. Starting with verse 125, the text reads, "We made the house a resort and a sanctuary for people, saying, 'Take the spot where Abraham stood as your place of prayer.' We commanded Abraham and Ishmael, 'Purify my house for those who walk around it, those who stay there, and those who bow and prostrate themselves in worship.' As Abraham and Ishmael built up the foundations of the house, our Lord, accept this from us. You are the all-hearing, the all-knowing. Our Lord, make us devoted to you. Make our descendants into a community devoted to you. This is a watershed moment in the history of Muhammad's followers. While mentioned elsewhere in the Quran, the impact of what this story is meant to convey cannot be overstated. In brief, Muhammad had initially directed his followers to pray like the Jews in the direction of Jerusalem. However, following these new revelations, it came to be understood that the Kaaba in Mecca had in fact originally been built by Abraham and his son by the slave Hagar, Ishmael. The Hebrew Bible is silent on the fate of Hagar and Ishmael once they are driven from Abraham's tent by the jealous Sarah. The Quran picks up on this silence and fills the gap by telling how Hagar fled with a young Ishmael to Arabia, where Abraham apparently paid visits to his firstborn son. While on such a visit, it's argued that they together built a house, the Kaaba. This sanctuary to the one true God fell into idolatry in subsequent centuries, but the Quran argues for its restoration. Once the Quran established this heritage, the community changed their direction of prayer away from Jerusalem and toward the Kaaba, which Muhammad would subsequently cleanse of idols once Mecca submitted to the growing power of Muhammad's community. While the direction of prayer apparently upset some Jews who were inclined toward the revelation, the adoption of the Kaaba as part of the Abrahamic lineage meant that many Arabs felt reconnected to Muhammad's message. Reasserting the sacredness of the Kaaba, establishing it as intimately connected to Abraham, apparently helped ease acceptance of the Quranic message. In many ways, this move epitomizes the message of Surah 2. If we read it as the establishment of a cohesive community, we can see how it struggles to unite disparate groups while maintaining elements that would appeal to what we would today call special interest groups. Jews, Arabs, and Christians, all three groups could find something that connected them to this new vision, a kind of syncretism of the dominant communities into which the Quran was revealed. While skeptics might call this blatant pandering, it can also, and I think more accurately, be read as political genius. Of course, the tradition maintains that this was God's genius, but whoever is responsible for it, the effect cannot be argued with. Before he died in 632, Muhammad not only brought Mecca into his political control, but he managed to unite, through various means, nearly the whole of the Arabian Peninsula. For a territory that had not previously known political unity, this was a monumental achievement and foreshadows the success of the community over the next 1,000 years. While much remains to be discussed regarding any of the chapters of the Quran I've mentioned here, the remarkable narrative arc is the transformation of a relatively minor member of society into the undisputed religious and political leader in Arabia, all within 22 years. That Muhammad's success was driven by a religious message initially at odds with nearly all of the prevailing local traditions is even more remarkable. The revelation rejected much of what was believed in the various pagan traditions and significantly modifies much of what Christians and Jews understood about their traditions. And nevertheless, at the time of the death of the Prophet, the Quran's message was rapidly spreading across North Africa and throughout the Middle East. As it spread, new communities would turn to the book, searching for ways to understand the revelation and find in it models for making a new community. The successors to Muhammad worked to compile the revelation in a standard text. As the newly united Arabs initiated a vast imperial project, the longer-lasting impact would be the spread of the message of the Quran into every corner of the earth. To understand the Quran then requires that we see its origins in 7th century Arabia, but also how it came to be read as a universal text. In the end, both things remain true. While obvious tensions arise in reading the Quran as both historically situated and universally applicable, it is that interpretive history that becomes the history of Islam itself.